Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing discussion of American cultural history, and in particular culture in the 1970s. In the past few lectures, we've talked about movies in the 70s, television, music, and a few other aspects of American culture. In this lecture, we turn to another realm in which the fault lines in American society played out, the realm of sports. In a previous lecture, we talked about the boxer Muhammad Ali as one of the most polarizing and controversial athletes of the 1960s. His career, of course, continued into the 1970s, and in many ways, he was even more prominent in the 70s than he had been before. He might well have been the most polarizing figure of his era. Many viewed him with scorn after he refused to submit to the draft for the Vietnam War, while others applauded his courage and supported him. There were actually several attempts on his life in the late 1960s and early 70s, and the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, said at one point, "That draft dodger will never fight in my state, period." When Ali fought Joe Frazier in March of 1971 in New York City, the fight in some ways became a metaphor for Vietnam. Ali represented the anti-war movement, the counterculture, and social unrest. Joe Frazier, according to some, represented a surrogate white hope, a pro-establishment representative of quote-unquote patriotic America. Frazier was not outspoken on political concerns, but to many, just by fighting Ali, he was taking the government's side. Both fighters jawed at each other. Frazier, throughout the build-up to the fight, and even during the fight, called Ali Clay. Ali called Frazier an Uncle Tom. Frazier won that first fight in a close decision. The pair went on to fight two more epic fights, with Ali winning them both. Along the way, Ali had another fight with similar symbolic importance. In the Rumble in the Jungle, October of 1974, he fought George Foreman. You might recall that Foreman had refused to go along with the black boycott of the 1968 Olympics, and instead waved an American flag in the ring after winning his gold medal. So in some ways he too represented the establishment when he fought against Ali. In Zaire, Africa, Ali walked as a hero among the people. He spent his time there mingling with the masses, learned some of the language, and became a huge fan favorite. During the fight, the crowd chanted for Ali and cheered whenever he struck a blow. Ali won in a stunning upset over Foreman, who was much bigger, 6 years younger, and heavily favored. On another level, though, Ali was a groundbreaking figure in sport. Prior to Ali, athletes generally didn't seek individual celebrity. They performed as if no one was watching. It was considered in poor taste to play to the crowd or the cameras. Ali was among the first athletes to truly develop his fame and image. "I am the greatest," he would shout. He read poems about his opponents and made brash predictions about how he would beat them. The 1970s was also a time when the mythology and purity of sports seemed to suffer. A spate of tell-all books broke the unwritten rule that what happens in the locker room stays in the locker room. Several books, including Johnny Sample's Confessions of a Dirty Ball Player in 1970, revealed the ugly side of the game, its violence, racism, and authoritarian structure. Similarly, Ball 4, published in 1970, the memoir of New York Yankees pitcher Jim Bouton, revealed an orgy of excess, drinking and womanizing that spoiled the image of baseball players as American heroes. A growing number of investigative journalists also probed the troublesome sides of sports. In the late 1960s, Sports Illustrated ran a lengthy series of articles detailing racism in sport and the plight of the black athlete. And it ran another discussing the growing problem of drug use among athletes. Several works of fiction also explored the darker side of sports, and a number of these books went on to become films. Dan Jenkins' novel, Semi-Tough, in 1972, portrayed football players as drinkers, womanizers, and drug users. Similarly, Peter Gent, a former football player, wrote North Dallas 40, published in 1973, a savage tale of broken dreams, intense pressure, and players abused by the system. In 1977, Semi-Tough was made into a movie, and in 1979, North Dallas 40 was released. Still, many Americans found it difficult to sympathize with athletes who played a game for a living and made increasingly high salaries. Though minimal by today's standards, player salaries rose dramatically in the 1970s as the strength of player unions increased. In 1972, the black baseball player Curt Flood sued the league for the right to become a free agent. While he lost his case, Flood brought attention to the lack of freedom for athletes, and the players' union soon went on strike to demand free agency. Other athletes in other sports made similar demands, and by the end of the 1970s, each of the major sports had introduced some variety of free agency, which gave players much greater power and resulted in much higher salaries. The money itself also skyrocketed as television and advertising rights escalated for all sports, especially professional football. Sports also became increasingly a realm in which women might participate and excel. As we've discussed in previous lectures, for much of the century, sport was considered inappropriate for women, as their bodies were not intended for excessive exertion. And again, we've discussed these issues before. But by the 1960s, female athletes began to excel in a number of sports. And in 1972, Congress contributed to the rise of women's sport by passing the Educational Act, which included Title IX. This act opposed gender discrimination and said no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational programs or activities receiving federal assistance. While it does not specifically mention sports, Title IX quickly became associated with sports in many ways, and it became apparent that sports would be included in its acts. In 1971, one Texas high school district provided $250,000 for boys' sports programs, and only $970 for the girls. Despite the vocal protest that argued that equality for women's sports would gut many men's programs, gradually the barriers came down and some semblance of equality was achieved. Women began participating in sports in greater numbers, and as early as 1980, women made up 30% of all college athletes. Still, there were discrepancies and progress was slow. In 1975, at the University of Texas, the phone bill for the athletic department exceeded the entire budget for women's sports. A symbolic moment in the rise of women's sport came on September 20th, 1973, when the great female tennis champion Billie Jean King faced aging Bobby Riggs, who called himself, quote, the #1 male chauvinist in the world. King had been a leading female activist on the tour, pushing for equal prize money and other benefits. Riggs, 55 years old and a long-retired tennis pro, sought to capitalize on the moment. He challenged King to a match. The match was played before 30,000 fans in the Houston Astrodome and aired to a massive television audience. Riggs was carried into the arena on a throne carried by bikini-clad women. King, similarly, was carried by well-muscled men. In the match, King thoroughly thrashed Riggs to silence the chauvinist. And this actually did mark an important moment in the gender equality in sport. While true equality in sport still has yet to be achieved even now, King's victory over Riggs crushed the myth that any man could defeat even the best women in any kind of sport, and served as an inspiration for a young and up-and-coming generation of female athletes who would go on to even greater things than King's victory in that match. In our next lecture, and final lecture about culture in the 1970s, we'll look at sport and culture in the late 1970s, an era in which the nation searched for meaning as the decade drew to a close and foreshadowed the decade to come.